The morning she realized her husband had told his friends she was a burden, Harriet Voss was standing in the kitchen of Aldenmore House at 5:30, watching the frost press itself flat against the window panes. She had not slept. She had not slept well in most of the 14 months since she had married Edmund Voss. No, not Edmund, she corrected herself, even in her own mind. He was Mr. Voss to the tenants, Voss to his friends, and to her he was mostly just a presence in the next room, a set of footsteps she had learned to track by sound the way one learns to track weather. She had heard it by accident, which was perhaps the cruelest way to hear anything. 2 nights before, she had come down the east staircase for a glass of water. She had forgotten to bring one up, and the bedroom was dry in the way that old houses are dry in November. And the study door had been left an inch open, and she had heard his voice, and then she had heard another voice, and then she had heard her own name used in a sentence she had not been invited to enter. She means well, I suppose, but she's not what I'd have chosen. The whole business was my father's arrangement, and there are days it shows. A pause. Then another voice, someone she recognized as Voss's oldest friend, a man named Hugh Carroll, said, "Does she know that?" And her husband said, "She's perceptive enough, she's just 2, and here he had paused, and used a word that Harriet had stood in the dark hallway and turned over like a stone in her hand. Accommodating. She accommodates everything. It's exhausting to watch." Hugh Carroll had laughed, not cruelly. Hugh Carroll was not a cruel man. He had laughed the way men laugh when something strikes them as a little sad and they don't know what else to do with it. Harriet had stood very still until the conversation moved to something else. Then she had gone back upstairs without the water and lain in the dark, and thought, carefully and methodically, about what she had learned. She had learned that her husband spoke about her to his friends, the way one speaks about a piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit the room, but that one has stopped trying to return. She had learned that what she had believed was patience, 14 months of learning the house, learning the tenants, learning the rhythms of a man who had never asked for a wife and had received one anyway. What she had believed was patience had in fact been registered as exhaustion, as burden. She had learned, in the quiet of a November staircase, that she had been making a home in a place that had not asked to hold her. What Harriet Wentworth had been before she became. Harriet Voss was a practical matter. Her father, Charles Wentworth, was a man of diminishing fortunes and expanding pride, a combination that had led him, in the winter of her 23rd year, to arrange a marriage between his daughter and the son of a man to whom he owed a debt he could not pay in any other currency. Aldenmore was a working estate in the hill country of western Pennsylvania, not the grand old wealth of the East Coast families, but real land, 3,000 acres of it, timber and tenant farms, and a house that had been in the Voss family since 1879. Edmund's father, James Voss, was a practical man, and practical men sometimes did practical things, and one practical thing was to look at a neighbor's daughter who was educated and capable, and not yet claimed, and to see in her a solution to a problem his son had been slow to solve himself. Edmund was 31. He had not married because he had not found anyone he particularly wanted to marry, which was not a flaw exactly, but was, in James Voss's view, a luxury a man with 3,000 acres and aging father couldn't afford indefinitely. Harriet met him 4 times before the wedding. She had thought, the first time, that he was handsome in a careful, withheld way, the kind of handsome that doesn't offer itself up but that you notice anyway, like the architecture of a building you pass every day. He had dark eyes and a way of holding very still when other people spoke, and she had initially interpreted this as attentiveness. She understood later that it was something else. He was not listening, exactly. He was waiting for the conversation to end, for the moment to pass, for whatever obligation he was currently discharging to be satisfied, so that he could return to something he actually wanted to do. She had married him on a Saturday in April. Her father had walked her down the aisle with the particular expression of a man who has made a difficult decision and is determined to feel good about it. Her mother had cried, which Harriet had found both touching and obscurely alarming. Edmund had looked at her at the altar with an expression she could not then name. She could name it now. It was the expression of a man fulfilling a contract, not unhappy about it, not unkind, simply present, in the narrow way that duty makes a man present, without the wider presence of desire. They had shaken hands, essentially. Only the shaking of hands had been a wedding ceremony, and everyone had eaten cake afterward, and Harriet had gone with him to Aldenmore. 14 months is long enough to learn a house. She had learned Aldenmore the way she learned everything. Methodically, without sentiment, because sentiment was not useful and she was, as her husband had told his friend, accommodating. She had learned where the east wing lost heat in October, and what that meant for the household fuel order. She had learned which tenants needed a firm tone, and which needed patience, and which needed both applied in sequence. She had learned that the old housekeeper, Mrs. Burnett, had a system for the linen storage that made no visible sense, but that worked perfectly and should not be altered under any circumstances. She had learned that Edmund Voss rose at 5:30 and was in his study by 6 and did not want to be interrupted before 8, and that he preferred his coffee plain and his correspondence handled promptly, and that he was not a cold man, not exactly, but that he had a radius of privacy he had never invited her inside. She had not pushed. Pushing was not in her nature, or perhaps it had been at some point, and she had stopped, somewhere along the way, because it seemed to produce nothing except the discomfort of both parties. She had built her life at Aldenmore the way birds build nests in occupied buildings, quietly, usefully, without calling attention to what she was doing. She had made herself necessary. She had made herself pleasant. She had made herself, she now understood, exhausting. The morning after she heard the conversation, she made his coffee and left it at the study door as she always did, and when he came to dinner she passed the bread and asked about the east fence line and listened to his answer, and he did not know that anything had changed. She was not certain anything had changed quite yet. But she had begun, that morning, to think. Aldenmore's nearest neighbor, in the social sense of the word, was a family called Oakes. A widow, Diana Oakes, and her son, a doctor named Philip Oakes, who had come back to the hill country after his residency in Baltimore to practice rural medicine and to look, in the indirect way that good men look, after his mother. Harriet had met Diana Oakes in her first month at Aldenmore, at a church supper, and had liked her immediately in the uncomplicated way that one sometimes likes the first person who speaks to them without performing anything. Diana Oakes was 62 years old, had survived a difficult marriage and a difficult decade after it, and had opinions about most things that she stated plainly, and without apology. She had looked at Harriet at that first supper and said, "You're not quite what I expected from the Voss family." And Harriet had said, "What did you expect?" And Diana had said, "Something more decorative and less observant. Finish your soup, it's getting cold." They had been friends since. It was to Diana's house that Harriet began to walk on Wednesday afternoons, not because she had arranged it, but because she had started walking to manage the particular pressure that had built behind her sternum since the staircase incident, and her feet had simply taken her to the one place where she did not have to be anything in particular. Philip Oakes she saw less often, but when she saw him it was in the context of his work. He had come to Aldenmore twice when tenants were ill, and she had worked alongside him without much conversation and with a competence that he had noted. She could see him noting it, with a kind of quiet reassessment. One afternoon in December he had said, "Where did you learn to do that?" She had been reapplying a dressing on old Mr. Finley's hand, who had put it through a barn door in a way that was entirely preventable, and which he deeply regretted, and she had answered without looking up. "Books, mostly. And watching." Philip had said, "You could do more than watch." She had not answered that. But she had thought about it afterward, in the way she had begun to think about many things, quietly, while doing something else, while the rest of her life continued to run on its established tracks. Edmund noticed nothing for 3 months. This was, she thought, almost impressive. He was not a stupid man. He was in fact quite perceptive in many areas: business, land, the particular politics of men who own adjacent things. But he had never applied that perceptiveness to her, and so the slow, gradual reorientation of her attention, away from Aldenmore's inner life and toward her own, went unremarked. She still managed the household. She still attended the dinners and the estate matters and the monthly meetings with the farm tenants. But she began, very quietly, to take up space outside the things that belonged to him. She began keeping a record. Not a diary, she was not sentimental enough for a diary, but a ledger of everything she did at Aldenmore that no one would know to replace when she was gone. The household accounts, the supplier relationships she had built personally, the names of the tenants' children and the ones who were struggling in school, and the ones whose parents needed to be approached carefully about the back rent situation, the location of the spare key to the granary that no one had thought to put on the main keyboard. She wrote it all down, clearly and without editorial, in a brown leather notebook she kept in the drawer of her writing table. She did not know then exactly what she was doing. She only knew that she had stopped waiting for the radius of privacy to open, and had started, instead, to take stock. The moment she could name, the exact moment, not the staircase but the one after, the one that decided something, came in late January. She had gone to the Oaks house on a Wednesday afternoon, and Philip had been there, and Diana had made them both sit down for coffee, and in the way of Diana Oaks, had left the room on a pretext and not returned. And so Harriet and Philip had sat across from each other in a small sitting room with a coal fire and talked. He had told her about a patient, a woman on the far side of the county, a widow, who had been managing a difficult health situation without access to proper care, because the nearest physician she could afford was too far and too expensive. He had been trying to organize a clinic, a once-monthly thing, at the church hall 3 miles away, but it required coordination. Someone who understood both the community and the logistics. Someone who could be trusted to handle the administrative side. He had been looking at her, not with intent, but with the straightforwardness of a man who sees a solution and states it plainly. "I imagine you'd be good at it," he said, "if you had the time." Harriet had thought about the word, time. She had 14 months of time at Aldenmore. She had filled it all. She had filled it so completely that her husband had told his friend it was exhausting to watch. "I could find the time," she said. And Philip had nodded as though this were obvious, and refilled her coffee, and they had talked about the logistics for the better part of an hour. She had walked home in the January dusk, and felt something she had not felt in a long while. Not happiness exactly, but its structural component. The sense that she was useful in a direction she had chosen. She told Edmund about the clinic that evening at dinner. He had looked up from his plate with an expression of mild surprise. A medical clinic? A monthly coordination effort. Dr. Oaks needs someone to manage the organizational side. I have the administrative experience from the estate. He had looked at her for a moment, not long. Then he had said, "It seems like a lot of extra work." She had said, "I don't mind extra work." He had returned to his dinner. The conversation had ended. He had not said yes and had not said no, because it had not occurred to him that his opinion was what she was waiting for. She had not been waiting for his opinion. She had been, she realized, giving him the information as a courtesy, a last small accommodation, before she stopped accommodating things she had not asked for. The clinic ran its first session in February. Harriet had spent 3 weeks organizing it, reaching out to the families she already knew through the estate, coordinating with the church hall, arranging the supply order, managing the schedule. Philip had looked at what she produced and been briefly speechless in the way of a man who has asked for a glass of water and been handed a well. 17 people came to the first session, 23 to the second. By March, she was spending 3 mornings a week on clinic-related work, and the tenants at Aldenmore knew her name in a way that went beyond Mr. Voss's wife. She had become, in the social geography of the hill country, a person, not an appendage of a person in her own right, with her own face turned in her own direction. Edmund still did not notice. Or rather, and this was the more accurate thing, he noticed the absence of something without being able to say what was absent. He came to dinner, and the bread was still passed and the questions were still asked, but something in the quality of her attention had altered, and he could feel the alteration without knowing how to name it. He was a man who dealt in the concrete, and this was nothing concrete, just a slight cooling, a degree or two, in the temperature of a room he had never thought to heat. In April, exactly 1 year after their wedding, though she did not remark on this, and neither did he, she sat down and wrote 2 letters. The first was to her father. She was not writing to ask permission or to seek comfort. She was writing to tell him, clearly and without blame, what the last 14 months had been, and what she had understood from them, and what she intended to do. She was also writing because her father was an old man who had made choices on her behalf that he believed were good ones, and she thought he deserved to know the truth of what those choices had produced. Not so he could feel guilty, but so he could, if he chose to know her. The second letter was to Edmund. She left it on his desk in the study, on top of his correspondence, where he would see it first thing in the morning. She did not seal it. She had nothing to hide. She had written, "I believe you are a good man who has made the same mistake many good men make, which is to take the presence of someone reliable so thoroughly for granted that you have ceased to register it as a choice she makes each day. I made the choice each day for 14 months. I am going to stop making it now, not out of anger, but because I have discovered that there are other choices available to me, and that you did not, when it was possible. Choose me in return. I wish you well. The ledger in the top drawer of my writing table will explain everything you will need to know to run the household without me. Mrs. Burnett will handle what it doesn't cover if you ask her in the right way, which is to say directly and without qualification. I have always respected you. I hope one day that amounts to something." She had not cried when she wrote it. she had found she was mostly past the part that required crying. That part had happened in the dark, on the staircase, in November, and she had cried then without anyone knowing, and it had been enough. She left the house before 6 in the morning, in the first week of April, with 2 bags and the brown leather ledger and the particular lightness of a woman who has put something down that she has been carrying without noticing. She stayed with Diana Oakes for the first weeks. Diana had not asked many questions, which was one of the things Harriet loved about her. She had simply opened the door and said, "Guest room is made up. There's soup on the stove." And that had been, essentially, that. The hill country is a small geography, and small geographies talk. By the end of the first week, it was known, in the way that such things are known, through church and commerce and the particular velocity of concerned friends, that Harriet Voss had left Aldenmore. By the end of the second week, it was known that she had not gone home to her father's house, and was not intending. By the end of the third week, Edmund Voss had found the ledger, had read it front to back, and had attempted to run the April household accounts without her, and had discovered, in the way that discovering can be a cold and sudden education, that what he had been watching for 14 months as a kind of ambient background operation was in fact a complex, sustained, daily enterprise that required skill and judgment and relationships he had never bothered to develop. He found the name of the tenant he needed to speak with about the East Field drainage. The name was in the ledger. He found the note about the supplier relationship she had renegotiated the previous October, saving the estate $200 a year on materials. That was in the ledger. He found the 3 families she had flagged as requiring sensitive handling on the back rent situation, along with her assessment of each and her recommended approach. That was in the ledger too. He read the ledger in a single evening, in his study, with the door closed. When he was finished, he sat for a very long time in a room that had not changed in any physical way but that felt, somehow, as though all the warmth had been removed from it, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the specific and total way that a fire goes out when no one thinks to tend it. Hugh Carroll came for a weekend in May, and Edmund told him without preamble that Harriet had left. Hugh said, "I know." Edmund said, "How do you know?" Hugh said, "I heard." "Edmund, what did you do?" And Edmund, who had been thinking about this question for 6 weeks, said, "Nothing. That's the problem. I did nothing at all." Hugh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's been running the clinic with Oakes." Edmund said, "I know." He did know. Everyone knew, in the way that everyone in small geographies knows the things that happen in them. He had heard that the March session had served 31 people, that 2 of the children she had connected to the county health program had received the care they needed, that his own tenant farmers spoke of her by name, with a warmth and directness they had never. He understood this now, clearly, applied to him. He had gone to the clinic once, in April, standing outside in a way that he recognized even as he did it as small and insufficient. He had seen her through the window, at a table, with papers in front of her and a woman across from her who was leaning forward in the particular way that people lean forward when they are telling someone something they have not told anyone. And she had been listening, not waiting, not processing. Listening. He had stood outside in the April cold and felt the absence she had described in her letter, the absence of someone choosing him, each day, as a choice, and understood for the first time what it was like to feel it from the wrong side. He had not gone in. He had not been ready yet to go in. He went in June. He had not announced himself. He had driven to the church hall, on a clinic morning, and sat in the back of the waiting area for 20 minutes, while a woman ahead of him spoke to the volunteer about her appointment. And eventually Harriet had come through the door from the main room and seen him and stopped. They looked at each other across a church hall waiting area, and he thought, later he thought, that he had expected her to look diminished. That was the thing he had half expected, in the part of himself he did not examine closely, that she would look diminished by being outside Aldenmore, outside the role she had filled, outside his orbit. He had expected her to look like something had been removed from her. She looked like the opposite. She looked like a woman who had been carrying a stone in each hand, and had simply put them down and walked away. There was something different in her face. Not happier, not sadder, just realer, as though a quality of straining had stopped, and she was now simply the thing she was, without effort. He said her name. She said, "I have appointments until noon." He said, "I'll wait." She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "All right," and went back through the door. He waited. He was not good at waiting. He had never had much practice. He sat in the church hall for 2 hours on a wooden chair, and looked at the information pamphlets on the table, and listened to the sounds from the main room. Her voice among them, clear and precise, asking the kind of questions that tell you someone is paying attention. And he thought about 14 months of being waited for by someone he had treated as inevitable. At noon she came out and sat across from him at the table and folded her hands and looked at him with an expression that was not cold and was not warm, but was entirely honest, and that honesty was harder to sit across from than either coldness or warmth would have been. He said, "I read the ledger." She said, "Good." He said, "I owe you an apology that I don't have adequate language for." She said, "Then don't try to do it with language." He sat with that. Then he said, "What would you want instead?" And she said, "I would want you to understand what it cost, not as a debt, just as a fact. I would want you to know, actually know, what I was doing every day, and what it felt like to do it without being seen, and then to decide, with that knowledge, what kind of man you want to be." He said, "I've been trying to figure that out." She said, "I know. Diana told me." He looked up. She said, "Your mother came to see me last week." This was not something he had known. His mother, Augusta Voss, was not a woman who made unannounced visits or disclosed her movements. He thought of his mother sitting across from Harriet, two women he had underestimated in different ways, for different reasons, and felt a complicated feeling that he did not have immediate access to. He said, "What did she say?" Harriet said, "She said she had not been kind to me and that she regretted it. She also said you were not sleeping well, and that you had reorganized the linen closet according to a system that made no sense, and that Mrs. Burnett was quietly furious." He almost laughed. He had not laughed in 2 months. The almost loss surprised him enough that he looked away. When he looked back, she was watching him with an expression that was, for the first time since she had seen him in the doorway, something that was not entirely neutral. He said, "I don't want to pretend I know how to do this," she said. "I'm not asking you to pretend," he said. "I want to try. Not because I need you to run the house. Because I have spent 6 weeks understanding what it is I actually lost, and it was not." He paused. "It was not a household manager." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 14 months. He said, "I know. I'm sorry it took this long to say it." She did not return to Aldenmore in June. She came back in August, not because she had been asked, not because she had run out of other options, but because she had spent the intervening weeks determining, as carefully as she determined everything, what she was willing to return to and what she was not. And she had found that what she was willing to return to was not what she had left. She had conditions. She stated them plainly, in the way she had learned from Diana Oakes. Without apology or softening, the clinic work would continue. The ledger system would be shared, not held by her alone. She would not be accommodating as a default. She would make choices, and she would say so when she made them. And he would have to learn to hear that as something other than a complaint. And she would not be. Here she had looked at him directly, in a way she had not looked at him in 14 months of marriage. She would not be something he described to his friends as a burden, however lightly, however offhandedly, in any room she was or was not in. He had said, "No, you won't." It was not an apology. It was a statement of intention, which was more useful than an apology, and she understood the difference. The county harvest gathering was held each year in September, at the Aldenmore barn, which was traditional and which no one had suggested changing. It was a working gathering, neighbor, tenants, local families, and it involved the kind of labor and the kind of ease that come with doing a recurring thing together. Edmund had, at gatherings past, stood at the edge of the work, and supervised and shaken hands and been. She had seen it in retrospect, at a slight remove from everything, present in the way that obligation makes a man present. This year he worked. He moved hay bales and talked to the Finley boys about the Eastfield project, and asked Diana Oakes's opinion on the proposed county road change in a tone that suggested he actually wanted it. He introduced Harriet to the 2 families she hadn't met as his wife, not as Mrs. Voss, not as she runs things inside, but as Harriet, who had organized the medical clinic and who knew more about the Eastern tenants' situation than he did, which was a fact, and which he stated as one. She noticed. She noticed also that his mother, Augusta, who had attended every one of these gatherings for 30 years, and who had spent the previous ones positioned near the house in a way that kept her adjacent to authority and slightly above the crowd, was this year in the middle of it, talking to Vera Callahan from the mill about Vera's daughter's college application, with her sleeves rolled up and her hands in the punch bowl ladle situation, and that she looked, if not warm, then something in the neighborhood of warm, which for Augusta Voss was a significant distance traveled. Harriet caught her eye once, across the barn. Augusta held her gaze for a moment. Then she gave the smallest, most contained nod that a woman can give while maintaining her dignity. Harriet nodded back. It was not a reconciliation. It was perhaps A beginning of one. The kind that doesn't announce itself. That just starts happening between people who have decided to stop making things harder than they need to be. Near the end of the evening, when the work was done and the food was mostly eaten, and the conversations had softened into the loose, unhurried kind that happen at the end of good gatherings, Edmund found her by the fence at the edge of the barnyard, where she had gone for a few minutes of quiet. He stood beside her without speaking. They looked at the hill country in the September dusk, the fields going gold at their edges, the tree line dark, the sky doing its complicated September thing where it can't decide between blue and something more serious. After a while he said, "I'm glad you came back." She said, "So am I, not easily." Not without the memory of November staircases and brown leather ledgers and mornings that had cost her things she couldn't fully itemize. But true. Simply, straightforwardly true. In the way that things which have been genuinely earned tend to be true. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. They were learning, both of them, that some things are better held than said, and that knowing the difference was, itself, a kind of beginning. The September dark came in from the hill country, and the gathering wound down, and the lights of Alden Moor House were warm at the end of the drive. And she walked toward them with her eyes open, choosing,